Hi everyone, welcome to this channel. Today, we're going to dive deep into something that's often puzzling but rarely explained in detail. Have you ever felt like you're being watched, even when you're alone? In this episode, we're going to uncover one of the creepiest stories you've never heard before. Thomas Granville was an ordinary man living an unremarkable life. At 29, he worked as a freelance architect in Reading, England, an old market town that had long lost its sense of excitement. Most of his days were filled with quiet, predictable routines. Nothing about his life hinted at the storm that was about to arrive. It all began on a damp morning in October, when a letter was slipped under his apartment door. It wasn't sent by post. There was no stamp, no return address. The envelope was sealed with red wax and bore a strange emblem, a circle enclosing an eye, with lines radiating outward like thorns. Inside, a formal letter informed him that he had inherited a property in a place called Barrows Hollow, a remote village in North Yorkshire. The letter claimed the house belonged to Edlyn May, his great-grandmother on his mother's side. A name he'd never heard. His curiosity, mixed with a kind of restless boredom, pulled him toward the unknown. Within a week, Thomas had booked a train north and rented a small car to reach the place. He never told anyone where he was going. Barrows Hollow didn't exist on most maps. It was tucked between ancient forests and rolling hills, shielded from the modern world. As he drove deeper into the countryside, the air grew colder, and the roads narrower. Moss-covered fences lined the way, and the fog crept in like something alive. When he finally arrived, the house stood like a black monument on a rise above a misty lake, tall, silent, and waiting. As he parked at the rusted gate, Thomas felt it. A pressure in the air. Not fear, something heavier. A presence. The house was a Victorian giant, dark stone walls streaked with ivy and grime. Shutters hung crooked on windows covered in stained glass, not ordinary stained glass, but ones etched with symbols that made Thomas's skin prickle. Circles within circles, open eyes, twisted vines, Latin inscriptions that weren't quite Latin. It was like the house had been built to keep something in, or keep something out. The key fit perfectly. The old door groaned open, revealing a silence that was thick and waiting. Inside, the air was stale with the scent of old paper, dust, and something else. Incense? Decay? It was hard to tell. What was stranger was how everything inside was intact, furniture, curtains, even old teacups still resting on their saucers. As if the house had been frozen in time. On the wall above the hearth was a portrait. An elderly woman, dressed in black, sat in a high-backed chair. Her eyes were pale and cold. Her hands rested neatly on her lap, fingers too long, too thin. The plaque read, Edlyn May, 1863–1942. In the study, Thomas found a black book on a desk, bound in cracked leather. It had the same symbol as the wax seal. No title. No markings. Just the sense that it shouldn't be touched, and yet, somehow, that it was meant for him. The next morning, Thomas ventured down into the village, hoping for groceries or at least conversation. But Barrows Hollow wasn't welcoming. The village consisted of a single row of old stone cottages, a crumbling church, and a general store. There were no signs, no lights in the windows. The people who passed him didn't smile. Some didn't even look. At the store, the elderly woman behind the counter barely acknowledged him. She refused to take his money. Simply handed him a bag and told him, without speaking, to leave. In the local pub, conversation died the moment he entered. The few men inside stared, some with recognition, others with dread. He tried to ask questions, but no one responded. A child who wandered near him was yanked away by her mother with a look of horror. It wasn't suspicion. It was fear. Not of him, but of his name. Of the blood that ran in his veins. By the time he returned to the house, he felt it. The villagers were hiding something. And whatever it was tied to the house, and to Edlyn May. That evening, as the wind howled outside and fog pressed against the windows, Thomas returned to the study. He opened the leather-bound book. The pages were old and brittle, the ink a deep red, too dark to be ink. The writing was uneven, scrawled in strange loops and foreign tongues. Some Latin. Some older. At the bottom of several pages, a phrase repeated over and over, written so many times the page had almost torn. The blood never forgets. It returns to the well. Some pages listed names, dates, and rituals. Others contained diagrams that looked like they belonged in an alchemist's journal. There were accounts of strange dreams, of creatures seen in mirrors, of voices whispering from the cellar floor. The longer he read, the more Thomas felt watched. Not by something outside, but something within. He looked up from the book, and for just a moment, the portrait above the fireplace seemed different. As if Edlyn's eyes had followed him. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The old bed creaked with every breath, and the silence was too complete. Around 2 in the morning, Thomas awoke, heart pounding. He wasn't sure why at first. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, echoing on the wooden floorboards just outside his door. They moved slowly, like someone in old shoes, or someone who had all the time in the world. He froze. The steps stopped right in front of his room. The door didn't open. Nothing moved. But he heard breathing, slow and wet, like a dying lung. His muscles tensed, but he couldn't move. It was like the air had thickened, weighing him down. After a long moment, the footsteps resumed, walking away, fading into the darkness. But just as he began to breathe again, there was a knock on the window. A single, clear knock. The window was on the second floor. When dawn finally broke, he forced himself to look. The glass was clean. No prints. But on the vanity mirror across the room, in the condensation from his breath, a message had appeared, written by an invisible hand. It has begun. By mid-morning, the house no longer felt unfamiliar, but it didn't feel safe either. Thomas wandered through the dim corridors, exploring what had once been Edlyn May's domain. Dust floated like ash in the stale air. Paintings lined the hallway, all of them unsettling, portraits of people with missing eyes, faces twisted slightly wrong, or looking away from the viewer entirely. It was when he reached the far end of the hallway, just beneath the winding staircase, that he noticed a door almost hidden behind a tattered curtain. It was low and narrow, made of warped wood reinforced with heavy iron rivets. A rusted chain wrapped tightly around it, secured by an antique padlock. The keyhole had been filled with wax. It wasn't a closet. It felt older. Colder. The air around it hung heavy with a stillness that didn't match the rest of the house. Even the floorboards here seemed quieter, like the house itself was holding its breath. Something was behind that door. Not rats. Not forgotten furniture. Something else. Thomas didn't know why, but he was certain of it. And he also knew, deep down, this was what he had inherited. That evening, as rain battered the windows, Thomas returned to the study in search of answers. He began pulling drawers from the ornate desk, hoping to find anything that might explain the history of the house, or its former mistress. In the bottom drawer, behind a false back panel, he found a thin, crumbling leather-bound journal. It didn't match the black ritual book from before. This one felt personal. The first pages were written in shaky cursive, to remember what they made me forget. It was signed, Edlyn M. The entries were sparse, scattered across decades. Some described rituals, but not with reverence. There was fear in her words, regret, even. She wrote of the blood gift, passed down through women in her line. A power that didn't come from God or nature, but from something beneath. Something in the earth. Something that fed on memory. Edlyn described voices whispering in corners, mirrors that didn't show her reflection, and a child, her own, that had vanished in the night. She claimed the villagers knew, that they had always known. That they watched her house not out of respect, but to make sure she never left it. Near the end, one entry stood out: "If you find this, you must not open the sealed door. The thing behind it wears my face, but it is not me." The storm outside grew worse. Wind slammed the shutters, and thunder cracked across the hollow. Thomas tried to focus, to make sense of what he had read, but a sense of unraveling had begun. It was like the house no longer accepted his presence as passive. When he went to wash his face in the upstairs bathroom, the mirror caught his attention. Something about his reflection was wrong. The room behind him appeared darker than it really was, the shadows deeper. And then, without blinking, the reflection of his own face shifted ever so slightly. His mouth curled upward, just slightly. But he hadn't smiled. He stared. The reflection held the grin for a second longer, then mirrored him once more. But it was enough. He staggered back, heart racing, only to hear a whisper behind him. Not spoken aloud, but inside his head. A woman's voice, dry and cold: "You brought it back." He spun, but no one was there. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was heavy. Watching. Waiting. That night, sleep was impossible. The house shifted with unfamiliar groans and muffled sounds behind the walls. At around 3 a.m., Thomas went to the kitchen for water. Under the flickering bulb, he noticed something strange on his arm. Just beneath the skin on his forearm, something moved. It looked like a faint bruise at first, but as he leaned closer under the light, he saw it was a shape. A circular sigil. The same one from the wax seal. It hadn't been there before. He scratched at it in panic, but it wouldn't fade. In fact, the more he touched it, the warmer it grew, almost pulsing. Then he heard the footsteps again. Not upstairs this time, but below. From behind the locked door. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. It was breathing. Then came the sound of nails scratching at wood. Slow, measured, from the other side of the chain-wrapped door. And then, a knock. 3 hollow knocks. Followed by a woman's voice, muffled and distant, yet unmistakable. "Thomas, my sweet boy. Come open the door." Panicking, Thomas backed away from the stairwell. He ran into the study, slamming the door shut behind him. He needed to leave. Pack up. Burn the house if he had to. But then he looked up. The portrait. Edlyn's painting above the fireplace. It had changed. The eyes that once seemed like dead glass now glistened, wet and alert. Her hands had shifted, no longer resting peacefully in her lap. Now they were pressed against the arms of the chair, knuckles white, as if she was trying to rise. But worst of all, her mouth was open, just slightly. A faint trail of blood dripped from the corner of her lips, staining the bottom of the canvas. The fireplace beneath it roared to life, unlit by any match. And within the flames, Thomas saw her shadow. Tall. Thin. Moving. Coming. And in that moment, the mirror on the study wall cracked from the inside, and the reflection of Thomas still stared, even though he had turned away. The final straw came when the leather-bound ritual book flew open on its own, pages flapping wildly until they stopped on a diagram of a man's body, marked with symbols. One of them circled the forearm. Written beside it, in Edlyn's unmistakable hand, were the words: "Inheritance begins with the mark. And ends in the hollow." Thomas dropped the book and ran. But the house didn't let him leave. Not that night. Not ever again. The next morning, after what little rest he could manage, Thomas left the house with the journal tucked tightly in his coat. He drove back into the village, its cobbled streets and old stone houses feeling strangely more hostile now. The locals avoided eye contact. Windows shut as he walked past. Conversations died mid-sentence in his presence. At the general store, the clerk who'd greeted him just a day earlier now refused to serve him. He asked, almost begged, if anyone knew about Edlyn May. The response was a grim silence, broken only by an old woman who muttered as she passed. She was meant to die alone. Now she's not. Thomas turned to follow her, but she vanished around the corner, as if swallowed by the town itself. It became painfully clear, everyone knew. And everyone had left him to face it. When he returned home just before dusk, the air had changed again. It no longer smelled of mildew and dust. Now it reeked of earth. Wet, black soil. As though the walls had soaked in the grave. The house was warmer. Not from the fire, but from something pulsing in its veins. It felt alive. And waiting. He found fresh footprints in the upstairs hallway, bare feet. Long, thin, and soaked in what looked like water or something darker. The footprints led to the guest room. The door was wide open. Inside, the bed was made perfectly. On it, a dress. Old-fashioned, violet silk with black lace trim. The kind Edlyn wore in the portrait. And on the pillow, strands of long white hair. Thomas backed away in horror, nearly falling. And just as he turned, he caught it in the mirror. Her. Edlyn. Standing behind him. Smiling. From that moment forward, the house stopped pretending. Doors no longer creaked, they slammed shut. The air buzzed with whispers. Shadows moved even in direct light. Time seemed broken. Hours passed in minutes, and sometimes the opposite. At night, Thomas would find himself in rooms he didn't remember walking into. Every object in the house had turned against him. The mirrors showed his future, bloody, wide-eyed, broken. The stairs shifted beneath his feet. Lights turned on when he slept. The journal began to write itself again, in Edlyn's hand, narrating his every movement. He goes to the study. He cannot help himself. He looks for her. He wants to remember what is not his. The final sentence chilled him most. He is almost ready. It wasn't until Thomas, desperate and delirious, tore the old boards from the floor beneath the staircase that he discovered the truth. There was no foundation. No stone floor. Only dirt. Black, rotting earth. And beneath it, bones. Thousands of bones. Skulls cracked open. Vertebrae twisted. A pit. A grave. A sacrifice. He dropped the lantern into the hole and saw something move. A shape, long-limbed and too thin to be human. Crawling, but not blind. It stared up at him with milky, lidless eyes. And smiled. Because it had his smile. It wore his face. That night, as the storm returned in full fury, the house went silent. Thomas no longer fought. He sat in Edlyn's chair in the study, watching the fire blaze without wood. The portrait no longer hung above, it was now empty space. But its shadow still loomed on the wall. The sigil on his arm burned brightly. The journal lay open in front of him. And with trembling hands, Thomas began to write. Not his own thoughts, but hers. He came because I called. The blood remembers. The hollow takes what it is owed. Outside, the villagers lit candles in their windows, not in mourning, but in tradition. The hollow had chosen its heir. As it had always done. In the stillness of the house, something walked up the stairs. Slow. Confident. Familiar. And from the darkness behind the mirror, a voice that was both Edlyn's and his whispered. Now we begin again. That was our story for tonight. Do you think it's just an ordinary tale, or is there something more to it? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. See you, if you still dare to watch next time.